The United Nations Food Agency says a record 12.4 million people in Syria are struggling to find enough food to eat. The World Food Program says the figure means 60% of the population in the war-torn country is now food insecure. The WFP spokeswoman Jessica Lawson said it is alarming that a basic meal is now beyond the reach of a majority of Syrians. A decade of war and militancy has ravaged the Syrian economy and sent inflation rates soaring across the country. Pardon. The Syrian conflict has killed now more than 387,000 people and displaced millions more since it began about 10 years ago. And now joining us for this news review is Judith Bellows, senior member of the United National Anti-War Movement, joining us out of Rochester, and Max Parry, investigative journalist, joining us from New York. Hello to the both of you. Always a pleasure to have you both on and give your respective perspectives on things today. It's Syria. Judith, we're going to start with you about the famine and food insecurity looming there.
So this is caused by the sanctions the United States has placed on Syria, which are essentially a part of their war on Syria. This is a siege war. This is a way to make sure that the people don't eat. It's a medieval tactic of war that they're using on the Syrian people, and they say that they're targeting government officials or whomever, but in fact, their goal is to starve the people into submission. And there is absolutely no excuse for this. Right now, it's nearly impossible to get aid into Syria. They had a whole flap at the United Nations 6 months ago or so, where they were voting on how many entry points the United Nations could have into Syria, but all of the entry points were into northern Syria, into either Idlib or into areas controlled by the Kurds in northern Syria. And so even the United Nations is restrained from providing aid to the people of Syria. Meanwhile, the United States is sitting not only on Syria's oil field, which provide not enough gas and oil to make a difference in the U.S. supply, but the amount of gas and oil that the Syrians need to work on rebuilding. And they're also sitting on a major grain producing area in Syria, which means that Syria either has to buy back its own grain or they have to buy grain somewhere else to feed the people. So between devaluing the currency and taking away the main resources that the people have, of course they're going without. And it's not a surprise. And the United States is singularly responsible, regardless of whom else they might want to blame for what's going on in these terms, because no one can overcome this kind of a barrier. So the UN, finally, they sent a rapporteur there on sanctions to look at this situation, and she was horrified, and she said that this is a war crime, and it is a war crime for the United States to be depriving people of the things they need to live. And they're not just committed in Syria. They've destroyed the banking system in Lebanon, and they're keeping aid from going into Yemen. Sanctions are on Iran, which at least has a measure of self-sufficiency that neither Syria nor Yemen have after all these years of war. So this is something that we need the world to look at. And we need to start seeing the world push back against United States behavior.
Thank you, Judith. And Max, I'd like to welcome you to the program. But now, Max, it's not just the U.S., is it? There are a lot of foreign players on Syrian soil, and they pretty much seem pretty well fed. And to Judith's point, some of them are sending even food home. So why are Syrian families facing starvation today?
Well, I completely agree with Judith. That there's no doubt that the increase in poverty and hunger among the already long-suffering Syrian people is a direct result of these, the Caesar Act sanctions, or Caesar's Law, were imposed last year by the Trump administration, and so far are being continued by the new administration as really a desperate ploy to put pressure on Damascus, the Syrian government, which in the last few years has, as we all know, scored several victories and thwarted the regime change attempt, which, as you say, yes, has not just been the U.S., but it has been in a coalition with, of course, Israel, Turkey, and the Sunni Gulf states, which are backing the mostly jihadist opposition. And, there's been a real turning point in the war in the last few years. So as a form of punishment, they've imposed these sanctions, which, it's just sickening. It's called the Syria Civilian Protection Act, when it's the Syrian civilians who are the ones that are directly suffering as a result of these sanctions, which prevent access to life-saving medicine and vital health services in the middle of this pandemic. I'm just not very optimistic, really, except for, as the other guest said, this United Nations special rapporteur. She did her findings. She did find that they were a war crime, and there was a recent broad appeal that she made with 90 signatories calling for an end to these sanctions. So if there's any hope of them being lifted by the Biden administration, it's going to come from that, by this rapporteur's report with the UN.
And Max, that's the thing. Why has the obsession with ousting Bashar al-Assad's government there in Damascus, justify the atrocities being committed to the Syrian people? How does that even make sense? You want a family and their cronies out that bad? You're willing to take a country and turn it to this extreme, upside down on its head?
It's completely paradoxical. It's completely paradoxical. They're waging a war of deliberate starvation, suffocating the Syrian people who have already been forced to endure this decade-long now proxy war with the sponsoring of terrorism. And now they're waging a new form of terrorism in the form of these sanctions that are causing an uptick in starvation and poverty, including in the midst of a pandemic. Biden has at least, he's reviewing the sanctions placed on Iran in regards to the pandemic. We can only hope that this UN rapporteur's findings will influence him to at least take a look at the sanctions on Syria as well. But it seems unlikely so far, given that, in the first month in his administration, we've already seen him send troop convoys into northern Syria, where the Kurds are, as the other guest said, who are actually exempt from these sanctions. And as a result, they're they're facilitating the U.S.'s theft of Syria's oil, which, that could go towards rebuilding the Syrian economy and the reconstruction of Syria. And, it's punishing Lebanon as well, who have been instrumental in Syria turning the tide and scoring victories.
Thank you, Max. And Judith, we have a couple minutes left. Your final thoughts, please.
Well, I think that the United States, on behalf of Israel, is attempting to restrain all the countries that are associated. So Syria and Lebanon and Palestine were a unit at one time, and the United States is trying to repress the political integrity of this society. And this society is not only the homeland of Judaism, but also of Christianity, and to some degree of early Islam. And so suppressing this really open regional society, which is very much open to many different sects and many different ethnic groups, and attempting to place it under the governance of an extreme Eastern, Middle East, and Eastern type of Islam from Saudi Arabia, from the deserts, is a way of ending this society which really had, a diversity that the United States could envy if they were so inclined. Because, so this is my final word is just that we need to work on our government to stop oppressing the people of this region and to allow them to breathe and to build their own society in whatever culture is native to that region, and to be open to other cultures around the world.
Okay, thank you very sincerely to both of you for joining us on the program and your respective perspective on this issue. Judith Bello, senior member for the United National Anti-War Movement. They're joining us out of Rochester, and Max Parry, investigative journalist, joining us from New York. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.